So, today I want to make the case for critical realism within sociology and look at the topic of causation in particular and what that means for a properly post-positivist sociology. So firstly, let me flesh out what I mean by critical realism. It's a very powerful term and it's been used by a number of people in philosophy and social philosophy and social science for a long time. Firstly, it's probably important to understand that there is no such thing as critical realism as such. It is a term that's been used by many different people, drawing on many different philosophical traditions to very different ends. Believe it or not, it's actually used by a very early Martin Heidegger to stake out a position between simple idealism and simple realism. It even appears in Christian theology, in Catholic tradition embodied in the work of Bernard Lonergan, and in Protestantism in Karl Barth, T.F. Torrance and Ian Barber, amongst others. It also appeared in America in the 1920s in a volume called Essays in Critical Realism, in which George Santayana, Arthur Lovejoy and Raywood Sellers, among others, argued against logical positivism and insisted on the structuredness of the world and our variable access to it. It has also recently been used by Sally Haslanger, who is most known for her work in the philosophy of social science and the philosophy of race and gender. In her words, critical realists eschew global claims about construction. The focus is on particular social structures and their impact in spite of their invisibility. And the term critical in critical realism situates the project within a broader tradition of critical social theory. And of course, what I will be primarily speaking about today, it appears in British sociology in the 1970s and 80s and is connected with the positions of Roy Bhaskar, Margaret Archer, Andrew Sayer, and many more. It's a position that's increasingly taken up and finding resonance in American sociology by people such as George Steinmetz, Philip Gorski, Christian Smith, and John Moore. So I'll be addressing this primarily today. In particular, I'll be focusing in on the work of Roy Bhaskar as very much a sort of exemplar of the post-positivist philosophy and sociology that I think we should be aiming towards. So, critical realism as an anti-positivist position. It situates itself as a critique of both naive realism and naive idealism, between positivism and social constructionism. Against idealism, it insists that we come to relatively objective knowledge of the world, but against naive realism and positivism, it insists that we only come to know the world in variable and fallible ways through models, metaphors, linguistic constructions and practices. The term critical realism is a very broad term insofar as it identifies these stakes, and the positions within it, positions of Roy Bhaskar, Margaret Archer, Andrew Sayer, while there are certain resonances between them, there are a number of notable differences in the way in which they parse out the term. The particular sociological current of critical realism emerged in the context of the science wars in the 1960s and 70s and the linguistic and postmodern terms, but also the formation of the New Left. And all of these are critical in understanding the ground that critical realism cements itself upon. Critical realism very often bears the marks of its birth within the context of these debates. Bhaskar's A Realist Theory of Science, for example, was published the same year as Paul Feuerabend's Against Method, an outline of an anarchist theory of knowledge, and sets out, obviously, a very different account of scientific progress. It is contemporary with the work of Lakatos and engaged with the various post-Wittgensteinian accounts of model building and rule following, which constituted that particular time and place. The situation of critical realism in relation to the New Left is an interesting one. As Tariq Ali, famous Marxist, Trotskyist, documenter, thinker, said at Roy Bhaskar's funeral, there is no question in anyone's mind that while there are only a few fleeting references to Marx, A Realist Theory of Science was a Marxist text. Which is quite profound and interesting. A realist theory of science, as it constructs itself, is an engagement with post-positivist philosophy of science, variously the positions of the post-Wittgensteinians. For it to be read as a Marxist text, on the surface seems to make very little sense. Of course, once you get into the text in detail, you see exactly what's at stake here. This was a time in the UK in which Marxisms abounded, various Hegelian Marxisms embodied in Lukács, and not only Lukács, the Frankfurt School, and the work of E.P. Thompson. But in particular, it was the philosopher Louis Althusser, who was very much in vogue in Oxford in the 1970s. Althusser had presented an account of scientific Marxism grounded in the work of French structuralism, which was heavily indebted to the philosophy of Gaston Bachelard and centered around concepts like the epistemic break, metonymic structures, and the overdetermination of causation. In fact, Althusser saw himself as rescuing Marxism from a certain Hegelian philosophy on the one hand, a sort of crude economics on the other, resituating Marxism as a science. And in a realist theory of science, this is very much what's at stake and very much what's on view. Bhaskar, again, is staking out an alternative. And it's not just an alternative philosophy of science. It is, in fact, an alternative philosophy of social science. In fact, insofar as Bhaskar engages with the philosophy of science, he is doing it for the sake of social science. This is very much a philosophy for social science and for the practice of social science. Now, central to the alternatives, the various Wittgensteinian alternatives, the various positivisms of the day, central to Bhaskar is the reivindication of ontology. Now, ontology is both a neglected and an abused term, and has generally been treated as an afterthought compared to epistemology and the theory of explanation in social science. I certainly believe social science needs to be framed out of a better consideration of ontology and a better understanding of the nature of the social world, if we are to do more interesting and more successful social science. Now, philosophically speaking, ontology is unavoidable. We are always already operating with models, whether conscious or otherwise, that inform our work, that focus our attention onto particular things which require explanation and that orient our explanations. The idea that social science can avoid theory or can avoid ontology and just get on with doing things, with doing empirical work, is naive at best, and I think ultimately damaging to social science. One has to philosophize. As one of my favourite quotes, an unexpected quote in Derrida, suggests, it was a Greek who said, if one has to philosophize, one has to philosophize. If one does not have to philosophize, or if one does not want to philosophize, one has to philosophize. One always has to philosophize. There is just no avoiding philosophy, there is no avoiding theory, there is no avoiding ontology. And the reason for this, again, is simple. We have to philosophize because a lot of what we do, both in theory and practice, is implicit. By ontology, I mean an account of the world in which we live, an account of the natural world, the social world, the entities that populate those worlds too. All of this, or the vast majority of this, is unconscious, it's implicit, it's embodied, it is presupposed. And philosophy, primarily, on my reading anyway, is about bringing our presuppositions into the open and being able to think and systematize our presuppositions so we can be more aware of what we are doing. Now, these two quotes I think are particularly revealing. The first being, of course, Bourdieu and Pascalian meditation. It is because we are implicated in the world that there is implicit content in what we say and what we think and say about it. So much of our understanding of the world is embodied in practice. In fact, the pragmatists perhaps have the best account of the philosophy of science. What is taking place in science? Science is not a mysterious thing. It is not a mysterious method. In fact, it is just a reflection upon our embodied practice. When we're concerned with understanding experimentation, what are we concerned with? We're not concerned with a method that's applied universally. In fact, we're concerned with the way in which scientists intervene practically in the world to understand the world. In fact, all knowledge begins with practice and our conceptual schemes are a sort of systematization of that practice in order to advance practice. And I think this is fundamentally the right gesture, and it's the gesture upon which Bhaskar stakes his claims as to the realism of the philosophy, sort of realism of natural sciences, which I'll go into in a little bit more detail in a moment. The second quote, of course, by, again, surprising quote by Albert Camus. For methods imply metaphysics, unconsciously they disclose conditions that they often claim not yet to know. Similarly, the last pages of a book are already contained in the first pages. Such a link is inevitable. Our methods, the way in which we approach the world, always presupposes things about that world. It orients our thoughts, it orients our thinking. It provides expectations, at the very, very least, things we expect to find using our particular methodologies. Now, the problem with all of this is that for the most part these are implicit and unconscious. Philosophy, our thinking about the world, I think generally takes place in background frameworks, which are not immediately evident and the results of which are not unmediated or directly visible. They are orienting and informative. Indeed, you could say they colonize the way in which we approach our work and the way we deploy concepts. And philosophy gives us resources for analysing the concepts that we use. In this way, philosophy and critical realism is far more of a meta-theory than it is a theory. It is a reflection on theory. It is theory on theory. It is about the concepts that we deploy at an abstract level. If theory is what we use to explain our empirical data or our cases, meta-theory is about the concepts we draw upon at a more abstract level, concepts such as causation and various forms of social ontology, and we might represent it in this way. Meta-theory informs theory, which informs our empirical engagements, and the lines flow the other way as well, that our empirical engagements inform our theory, which in turn informs the meta-theory. It allows us to reflect upon concepts such as causation, so that ultimately all philosophy is empirically grounded at some level. There is no such thing, and there should be no such thing, as a purely a priori philosophy, one that is removed from any engagement with the world. Now, just to focus in on ontology, again, we all operate with presupposed ontologies about what the world is like, the way that it is ordered, the way that it is regular. We have ontologies of agency, of structures, and of causation. And often these are inherited or received. And because of that, we're not often aware of the process of their formation or their implications. So, for example, if we roughly follow Durkheim, then collective phenomena can be seen primarily as the expression of enduring relationships. This is Durkheim's ontology. Likewise, we can parse this out to questions of whether the social world is essentially groups, whether it is essentially relations, networks, rational agents, or the combination thereof. These are not simply methodological choices or epistemological choices or epistemological lenses with which we view reality. There are real ontological differences between these accounts. For example, when we are subsuming empirical data under general laws, whether we have an aversion to motives or rules or vice versa, we are always involved in social ontology. We are always presupposing something about the agents, the structures, and the relations that we are investigating. Now, perhaps this is most clearly seen in methodological individualism, in which supposedly genuinely holistic behaviour, and I'll use Basquiat's illustrations here, such as riots and orgies, turn out simply to be aggregates, and the social is simply is synonymous with the group. The issue then is whether society and the whole is greater than the sum of its constituent parts, whether individual people, whether social behaviour is explicable as the behaviours of groups and individuals, groups of individuals in the case of riots, or of individuals in groups in the case of orgies. In other words, these approaches, methodological individualism, various Durkheimian forms of methodology, all inevitably presuppose and secrete particular ontologies about the objects of which they are investigating. Perhaps the most enduring ontology, however, is positivism. and it's based on the reproduction of an ontology that is drawn from the natural sciences. As has been stated many, many times in many, many different places, it is important for social sciences to avoid the fallacy of naturalism and its various errors. The first error, and perhaps the most significant, is to suggest that social science should model itself on natural science, and related to this, that ultimately social entities have a similar constitution and a similar ontology to natural entities. Particularly when it comes to accounts of structure and when it comes to accounts of causation. These tend to be the test cases in which the relationship between the natural sciences and the social sciences are played out. The second error, however, is related, and this is to reject science and explanation wholesale, largely based on the perceived incompatibility between natural sciences and social sciences. Now, I think we can probably imagine all the damage that's been done by various misconceived ontologies, from the problems of radical behaviorism or radical social constructionism, or just what Andrew Abbott has called the variables analysis. Likewise, the attempt to theorize the essence of social phenomena like revolutions or social movements, or treating them as if there are social kinds or entities which can be treated as uniform, context-independent things. This, I think, is where the critical realism of Roy Bhaskar is particularly strong, in its critique of positivism. For Bhaskar, at the heart of positivism is the constant conjunction form, and this particular account allows us to see what is precisely at stake in the positivist account of social science, or of the natural sciences for that matter. The fundamental idea is that when we are concerned with questions of causation, when we are concerned with investigation into the natural or the social worlds, what we are concerned with is ultimately the way in which two or more events are related by various mechanisms, whether that is a single mechanism in the ideal case or a series of mechanisms. This is also connected with the idea of same cause, same effect. And it is modelled in something along these lines, the constant conjunction form, that when X and the various conditions or the various variables associated with X, then Y. It is a particular form of passive causation, and it's primarily concerned with following rules, laws, and patterns. And key, critical to this, is this idea of same cause, same effect. And this allows the possibility of generality, generalization within social science and within natural science, because where X we can predict, then Y. Now, the central argument in Bhaskar is to suggest that this model of causation only holds in the most exceptional of circumstances, primarily in the laboratory in which scientists actively control their environment to isolate particular mechanisms and their operations, or to produce particular results. Nancy Cartwright calls these nomological machines, various apparatus that are set up to produce regularities. The problem is, of course, when this model is embodied in people like Karl Popper and Karl Hempel is transplanted across to the social sciences, we run into a problem of ontologies, namely that the social world is fundamentally open in nature. It is not like the laboratory, the closed laboratory of the scientist. It is fundamentally open. Indeed, the idea of even reproducing something like an experimental closure in the social world is, on its face, just implausible. The possibility of closing the open system to such an extent that we are able to produce regularities in a constant conjunction form is mythological at best. Indeed, even in the natural sciences, when we think about the natural sciences, outside of the laboratory, the constant conjunction form doesn't hold. It is only in the most controlled circumstances that anything like a constant conjunction regularity can be found. The world, the natural world, and even more so the social world, is open, changing, and variable. And so we have this particular account of causation. Causation in the laboratory and what George Steinmetz calls causation in the wild. In the laboratory, it is of course controlled, and so we do have constant conjunctions, where we have single mechanisms or even a cluster of mechanisms that regularly produce results in the form of event 1, event 2. Causation in the wild is a different beast in that we have multiple mechanisms operating in an overdetermined fashion to produce overdetermined events, which may or may not express themselves in the form of a constant conjunction. Now, the second case that Pascal mounts is that in order to understand the natural sciences, and indeed this applies somewhat to the social sciences as well, it is important to separate out three aspects of explanation. The first aspect is the empirical dimension, for want of a better term, which consists of experiences, observations, and measurements. For positivism, this is the key category. In fact, what we are primarily concerned with is measuring experiences, observation, and measurement. The second aspect or dimension that Pascal identifies or identifies contra-positivism is the domain of the action. And this consists of events, things, products, and is the basis of our experience. In a sort of classic Althusserian term, we might refer to this as the symptom. And of course, the symptom is only there as an outward manifestation. What we are interested in, what scientists are interested in, what both in the natural and the social world, is this domain of the real, which is perhaps slightly unfortunately named. But in the real, we're concerned with generative mechanisms, causes, powers, and structures that produce events upon which our experiences are based. This helps to parse out exactly what is taking place in positivism. In fact, in positivism, we find a complete collapse of all three dimensions into a single one, which is experience, and the relationship between events, which are inevitably based upon experience. So in the positivist sieve, reality filters out as unstructured, undifferentiated, and unchanging. It is characterized by atomistic events and causations based on this idea of same cause, same effects. For positivism, the knowable world contains neither hidden or discernible mechanisms or powers. The world is in fact dissipated in and exhausted by a strange combination of fleeting and yet relentlessly uniform regularities that are ultimately based on experience and on our empirical data. In fact, reality itself is seen to be populated ultimately by isolated facts which can be mathematically modelled. This is the heart of a positivist ontology when it is broken down. Because of this, and indeed as a result, scientific positivism dehistoricises and de-stratifies science. Facts are perceived as being natural entities in the world that the scientist is able to reach out and grasp through the various methodologies. Because it dehistoricises and de-stratifies science and the conditions of possibility for science, it collapses and de-stratifies the generative and sustaining context and modes of production, reproduction, and transformation of science and the conditions of science, and naturalizes, dehistoricizes, and eternalizes them. And the characteristic embodiment of this is the pursuit of a scientific methodology, the sort of logic of science itself, the essence of scientific investigations and scientific pursuits. The idea that once we have this basic logical model, then we can apply this uniformly, and this will give us a true scientific account of the world. It is a complete fetishism, and it presupposes very problematic aspects about the natural and social world. However, positivism and I think this is the more interesting point as well, positivism is not simply isolated to this form of scientism and mathematical logical modelling. In fact, most people would not identify with something that resembles this, I think. There are very few people who want to identify as positivists. As Raymond Williams said in the 1970s, positivism is a swear word by which no one is swearing. It is a term of malign, it is a term of hatred. Nobody wants to be a positivist. In fact, no one is a positivist anymore. But what we find is that we have one party and two factions. We have the scientistic positivism and the neo-Kantian anti-positivist interpretation. In the interpretivist register, for example, I'm primarily thinking of Weber, but also in Durkheim, the positivism of regularities is cast slightly differently. It's no longer laws, it's no longer a sort of natural law-like form, but regularities are cast into a net of conceptual schemas which completely and overwhelmingly structure agents and their experience of the world. Regularities become akin to linguistic frameworks, or philosophically speaking, the Kantian a priori scheme, which is cast over a chaotic manifold, to use Weber's term, without which agents would simply be lost. And so instead of atomistic events which are structured by law-like forms, we have atomistic events which are structured by linguistic models and constructs. The result being Durkheim's collective effervescence and his social structure modelled on linguistics in the case of the elementary forms of religious life, and Weber's completely existential engagement in which approaches on reality are not convergent and are always agonistic and antagonistic. In fact, this is fundamental to Weber's category of ideal types, that values and objectivity struggle in sort of immortal competition with one another, and indeed values themselves are always always vie for supremacy, such that there is just no possibility converging on social reality if we want to hold to anything that appears value-laden. For Basco, however, the solution to these problems is simple. We need a better account of science and we need a better ontology. So if we think about the world as we know it, it seems to be a world in which all manner of things happen and are done, and which we are capable of explaining in various ways, and for which explanation in the form of a constant conjunction of rule or a law simply doesn't work. At best, it produces an incompletely described world. Instead, what we are dealing with is always a picture of a world that is rich in different things, behaving in different ways, organised and assembled in different ways, and acting and interacting in different ways. This is a picture of the world and of causation, less like a system, less like laws, and more like a patchwork, a collage, or as Daniel Little suggests, and I love this image, a flea market. Now, if we think of a flea market, in the flea market, a jumble and disorganised mix of different products, of commodities and material objects, and different people, vendors, police officers, shoppers, shoplifters, pickpockets, all come together, move about, enter into different relations with each other, including buyers, sellers, acquaintances, friends, which are dependent upon and reproduce different social forms, so language, expressions, cultures. There is no overall guiding design, and it is a highly disorganised and random, but it is not completely chaotic. There are pockets of order and pockets of patterns, but these are ordered in almost a disordered way. The order is not a manifestation of a few simple factors or a guiding system, but a large number of heterogeneous but interdependent conditions, processes, forces, and structures, which give it its peculiar quality of chaos on the one hand and order on the other. Now, none of this can be described in the language of laws of nature and is not governed by them. So here I want to make the case that laws do not describe the patterns the patterns of events or legitimate predictions of any kinds of events. Rather, they must be conceived, at least when it regards the various ordinary things of the world, as situating limits and imposing constraints on the types of action possible for a given kind of thing. This allows us actually for a limited conception of naturalism, in fact a critical naturalism, to use Roy Bhaskakar's phrase, based in a reconstructed account of structures and causes, which has import in both the natural sciences and the social sciences. Let me flesh this out using an illustration. It's going to be an Australian illustration, so I'm sorry for that. And it's going to involve the game of cricket. A game of cricket is only partially controlled by the rules of cricket. I'm sure this is true of baseball and American sports in general. So a game of cricket is only partially controlled by the rules of cricket, just as language using is by the rules of grammar. In fact, the language here is not of structures, but what we might call generative structures, to use Chomsky's famous phrase when it comes to linguistics. The rules are generative, providing boundary conditions within which action takes place. They structure, broadly speaking, an event in which activity takes place. So the difference between laws of nature and empirical generalizations is analogous to the difference between the rules of cricket and a television recording of the actual play on some particular occasion. Whether or not a particular cricketer scores a century is not determined by the rules of cricket, but by how he bats and how the opposition play. Now, it's important and it's clearly necessary for the intelligibility of the game that there are principles involved. But these are far more in the realm of background conditions which structure a particular event. And in fact, it becomes clear that when we want to understand something as simple as a game of cricket, we need a stratified and differentiated ontology with higher order and lower order levels. The higher order levels that control the boundary conditions of the game in which the game is played, and then the lower order levels which determine the conditions under which the laws of that level apply. So in other words, we have nested accounts of levels, each of which structure the particular event we're concerned with. If we're thinking of cricket or if we're thinking of sports, just to run with this metaphor a little further, we know that weather is involved, we know the rules of cricket are involved, we know that the personalities of the cricketers are involved. Each of these form various levels of explanation which situate the events that are taking place and are required to understand precisely what is taking place in those events. To use the words of George Steinmetz, within this context, causation and structures are always complex, they're always contingent, they're always contextual, they're always a conjunction of different features, and they are always always invariably changing, if that's not a ridiculous thing to say. In fact, I think what we are more interested in when it comes to the social world and the natural world for that matter is what has been called assemblages, the productive intersection and hybrid of various material forms such as persons, bodies, artifacts and things, practices, actions, activities and agencies, relations that are both interpersonal and structural, social resources such as capital and culture, and various forms of expression, including affects, words, discourse, language games, rules, and ideas. Now, all of this becomes more important because in the social world we are not simply dealing with agents that move about the whims of structures. We are not simply dealing with people who are bearers of structures, who unproblematically reproduce social regularities, or somehow unproblematically act, if act is the right term in such a context. And this, of course, is another aspect in which Roy Bhaskar critiques Althusser, and the very, very strong account of structure, which makes the agents living under capital and living under capitalism like marionettes, like puppets, dancing to the whims of the structure. Indeed, we are always fundamentally dealing with social agents who transform and reproduce their world, who act according to reasons, desires, and emotions. So already, again, we find this intersection between causes as being overdetermined and the structures in which causation, various forms of causation, take place, and the structures of which are reproduced and transformed in various ways according to, for example, the reasons, desires, and emotions of actors. And Bhaskar argues that, in fact, when we think of the social world in this way, we can think of reasons as being causes, as being analogous to the various causes and agencies that take place in the natural world, only insofar as we understand precisely what is taking place in the natural world in the complex, contingent, combined, conjunctural account of causation that it represents. So that when a coal miner votes for the Labour Party in the UK, or for that matter for Donald Trump in these United States, they have reasons and desires for doing so, even while those reasons, emotions, and desires are situated historically, informed by ideology, reproduced and transformed by various practices, are changing, are animated by rhetoric, and even may operate against the best interests. But in order to understand it, we need a good, strong, thick account of causation, and a good, strong, thick account of social structures. So this is what Roy Bhaskar bases his account of naturalism on. His second book is famously called The Possibility of Naturalism. It might also be called, and as he's gestured at some points, the impossibility of naturalism, because there is a fundamental tension that always exists between the natural and social sciences along these lines, and that while models of causation and structure, if they're sufficiently complex and sophisticated, can be reproduced at some level from the natural sciences, there are fundamental differences in how we treat these particular concepts and ontologies. Social structures and social causes do not exist independently of the activities they govern. Social structures and causes do not exist independently of the agent's conception of what they are doing in their action. Social structures may only be relatively enduring. They may be tendential in their existence. They may not be universal. They may not be, well, they're certainly not universal, and they're certainly not space-time invariants. All these and more indicate the real differences between the objects of knowledge in the case of the natural and the social sciences, while still allowing for a modicum of translation that can take place between these, between concepts of open systems and closed systems, between concepts of structures, between concept of causation, so that a philosophy of social science and a philosophy of science can, in fact, coexist and can, in fact, inform one another. In fact, if we wanted to follow Sandra Harding, and I think this is good advice, we would situate the natural sciences within the social sciences. The social sciences being the broadest possible understanding of concepts like causation, concepts like structure, and then the natural sciences just being a very, very narrow end of that broad spectrum. Let me finish with just a quick nod to the critical aspect of critical realism. And this is the critique of the constant conjunction form. The problem with the constant conjunction form and the covering law model is that it covers over many of the different forms of causation we are interested in, and it masks the differentiation and stratification of the social world. Insofar as causation is always overdetermined, so far as we're concerned with open systems, we find various forms of causation in the social world which are of supreme importance. We're likely to find multiple mechanisms which generate similar results, or similar mechanisms that are liable to produce different results. And we are able to theorize causal singularism, heterogeneity, context sensitivity, tendencies, mechanisms which change over time, which produce their effects over time, which are tendencies as well as unique and individual propensities of things. This is not a neutral project. There is a reason we are interested in causation and understanding these different forms of causation. In fact, the constant conjunction form has a pernicious influence. It acts, as Bhaskar says, so as to conceal the reality of structures which are irreducible to events or their manifestations, and more particularly of social structures to human actions and of societies to individuals. This way it diffuses the possibility of social science and the possibilities of change by masking the unwilled structures which are at work and which are invisible and which are unconscious in social life. Now, the model he uses is here as an example is Marx's analysis of the wage form. For Marx, the social function of the wage form, not how it is intended, but how it acts, is to conceal the reality of exploitation, unpaid labour, and the source of surplus value. This, for Bhaskar, is very, very similar to how positivism functions. It annihilates the possibility of analysing and critiquing forms of social structure and social causation which remain otherwise invisible. In fact, the animating drive, as I said at the start, is philosophy for social science, but it is more than that. It's philosophy for an emancipatory social science. Bhaskar is a Marxist through and through in that regard, and the account of causation and the account of structure is in service of a critical sociology, and a very Marxist sociology at that. One final comment. Given the sort of withering critique of positivism that Bhaskar puts forward, is there any saving anything within positivism? Is there any saving anything within something like the search for constant conjunctions, even if it is only a heuristic? Is positivism to be dismissed completely wholesale? I think the answer has to be not quite. And I think while Bhaskar doesn't theorise that we see aspects of it in his earlier work, that is that constant conjunctions can be understood as proto-laws, potential causal relationships. In fact, we could probably resituate positivist science or the search for constant conjunctions or regularities or whatever we want to call them in two places, and to use the terms in the context of discovery and in the context of justification. In the context of discovery, the moment concerned with the formation of scientific theories, the search for constant conjunctions provides a springboard for further investigation. Upon discovering a constant conjunction or a regularity, or what Tony Lawson calls a demi-regularity, to get at the fundamentally open aspect of any account, upon discovering such a regularity, we have a possible causal relationship which allows us and which requires some degree of investigation, either to confirm that there is a relation or to show that there isn't one, if it is significant enough. At best, they are then broad descriptive generalizations or tendencies which draw our attention to certain forms of causality in the social world which might otherwise go unnoticed. Secondly, in the context of justification, the moment in which we defend our theories, I think this sort of positivist social science is able to operate insofar as it's able to hint at and perhaps show the depth and breadth of particular generative mechanisms at work, which we are trying to identify. What it is unable to fundamentally do is to provide any form of explanation, which requires an intensive investigation to the forms revealed by our extensive examinations, and which requires a generative account of structures and a complex account of causation operating behind it. For these reasons, I think critical realism in the work of Bhaskar has an important contribution to social science. And I'll leave it there.
Perfect.